Hi there and welcome to the channel of A Disappointed Man with me, Jason Kennedy, the Disappointed Man, coming to you today from a very, very cold Taiwan. Okay, so this video will be part one of my 2022 wrap, a look back at my reading. I think I'll begin by talking about goals and actually saying that I did not have any reading goals this year. Instead, I had some life goals. The first of them, and this took up from sort of January to May, was finishing off writing my thesis, defending it, and graduating with my master's degree. The next thing was finding a place on a PhD program, and I managed to do that too. I got an offer in October and then another one just last week, and I've decided now where I'm going. And the third goal was to start a YouTube channel about books, which is what you're watching right now. And I've managed to produce somewhere approaching 80 videos, which I think is pretty good for my first year on BookTube. And now, having talked about that, I'm going to briefly go through kind of the first half of all the books I've managed to read since May in terms of poetry, prose and drama. And the total was over 60. So what I'll do in today's video is just go from 1 to 30 in no particular order. If I have a review up on the channel of the book, I may mention that in passing, but I'm not going to try and say which number it is. All of the details, as ever, will be in the description below. All that being said, let's begin. We start off with Sir Walter Scott's Rob Roy, his wonderful historical romance. This had passion, adventure, intrigue, and quite a large dose of humour too. I can't recommend it enough. Next, Richard Brinsley Sheridan, The School for Scandal and Other Plays. I didn't read The School for Scandal. I read The Rivals, a farce. It was so funny. I'll put a link in the description below to a wonderful production of it. And it contains the character, Mrs. Malaprop, who you may have heard of. Next, a Canadian writer, Robertson Davies, Fifth Business. I reviewed this. This was a real find. Starts off really fusty and becomes more and more magical, and the last 100 pages or so were pure excitement. Very well plotted too, actually. Next, Anne Bronte's Tenant of Wildfell Hall. I've not finished it yet. Anyone who's read this will know how hard it is to get through the second section, and that's where I'm rather bogged down, getting infuriated by the Arthur character. G.K. Chesterton, The Napoleon of Notting Hill, a very short novel, one of his 2 novels. And the thing about this is no one writes like Chesterton. Every sentence in this has his mark, and he is certainly, in my estimation, a genius. I will review that one at some point. Another genius, Mark Twain, Pudd'nhead Wilson. This was so funny. It's based on the premise of babies being switched at birth, a white one and a black one in the American South. And it's also notable because it uses the new technology of fingerprinting as a central feature of the story. Very good. Dennis Potter, most well known for writing for television, but he did knock out a few novels. This one, Ticket to Ride, is based on a man being on a train going somewhere, and suddenly he can't remember anything at all about himself, and he has to try and find out, which is what he spends the rest of the novel doing. As he does so, the reader will become increasingly confused, and it has a very strange ending where you just think, huh, what happened? But there's a lot of really good writing as the central character stumbles around London. Next, my Shakespeare play for the year, Measure for Measure. Not his best. It's based on the idea that you will reap what you sow. Okay, anyone familiar with it will know it's not the strongest one from the Bard. Charles Maturin, Melmoth the Wanderer. Famously, Oscar Wilde adopted the sobriquet Melmoth when he was in exile in France in his last sad years. This was superb. If you enjoy Frankenstein, seriously recommend picking this one up. I reviewed this. Prosper Mérimée, Carmen and Other Stories. I did not really go into the stories enough in my review. I should have said more about some of them. The one about a statue of Venus, a green statue of Venus, is an amazing story of the supernatural. And all of these were so varied. He was really the pioneer of the short story in the French language. Yes, this was a great find. A classic next. Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. I did a reaction rather than a review. I don't think it's possible really to do a review. You just read this and are completely flattened by its power. I think it took me 2 or 3 days to think clearly again after being immersed in the world that she creates for us there. Next is Sir Walter Scott once again, The Bride of Lammermoor. And I put this after Wuthering Heights because Emily Bronte drew heavily upon Scott's novel in writing Wuthering Heights. There are analogues in terms of the characters. Joseph in Wuthering Heights, Caleb in The Bride of Lammermoor has the same intense atmosphere of her novel. If you enjoyed the one, you'll enjoy the other. This was also made into an opera. Zora Neale Hurston, Jonah's Gourd Vine. Not her best, but even a poor Zora Neale Hurston novel is still magnificent. I think this was her debut, actually. And yes, it crackled with verbal energy. Another adventure story, Kidnapped. This is rather like Sir Walter Scott for Boys. Yes, from Robert Louis Stevenson. I really enjoyed it. Characters are really well drawn, and Stevenson is really good on the psychological side of things. Next, James Hanley Boy, which was review number 1 on the channel. Incredibly bleak, rather depressing in fact, but powerful too. Strongly recommend this one. Another bleak read is George Douglas Brown's The House with the Green Shutters. I reviewed this too. I really enjoyed it. Unlike Boy, it has a streak of black humour running through it, and the final act of this family tragedy was drawn out and magnificently written. Very good. Sadly, he only wrote 1 novel in his very short life. Next, D.H. Lawrence, 3 novellas, and the best of these in my view is The Fox. It's like a Southern Gothic story in the mould of Flannery O'Connor or Catherine Ann Porter. Very satisfying. Then more Lawrence, The Prussian Officer and Other Stories, and I would go so far as to say that The Prussian Officer is one of the best 2 short stories I've read in my whole life, the other one being Kafka's In the Penal Colony, or In the Penal Settlement, as it's sometimes titled. Amazing, brilliant, genius. Then this, Elizabeth Bowen's The Death of the Heart. I did review this. It's the only negative review I did. I really laid out my case against it and had messages from students thanking me for doing so and saying they disagreed. They thought it was a good novel, but my comments nevertheless were very helpful. But after that I thought, Jason, no more negative reviews. Oh, this book, Patrick Hamilton, Handover Square, superb from the first sentence to the last. Dark, depressing, suspenseful, violent, excellent. What do we have here? These 4 Theatre of the Absurd plays. These are all really good. I'll do a review of them in time. The Fernando Arrabal one was particularly good, and also Arthur Adamoff. Great find. Oh, an old favourite here. It is Saki, the Complete Saki. I did a review of this, which I titled Part 1, and I still haven't got round to Part 2. That's because there are so many stories to get through. There are some perfect examples of the genre here. The Open Window and The Mouse. You can look them up online. I'll put a link in the description. They're only 4 or 5 pages long, but brilliantly done. So funny. Next, The Secret Garden, which has the distinction of being the only book this year that moved me to tears. I was so deeply engaged with this. It was magical. Then, Len Deighton, $1 Billion Brain. I was surprised at how good this was. I don't usually read these kind of spy thrillers. I couldn't follow the plot at all. I had no idea who was working for whom, but there was a dry humour here that really engaged me. Then I reviewed this, Selected Short Stories of Guy de Maupassant. this was wonderful, and it really fed my appetite to read more of the stories by this great writer. Such variety. Next we have Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott, or Ivenslow as I dubbed it, by far the weakest of the 3 Walter Scott novels I read this year, and actually this could even be considered children's literature, so preposterous as some of the events featured here. Had its moments and some good characters, but it was far too baggy, about 200 pages too long. Then this was not baggy. Agnes Gray by Anne Bronte. I really enjoyed the first half, which is full of her observations on life as a governess, and then it rather sunk into genre fiction in the style of Jane Austen, and had a happy ending that I didn't really approve of, but very, very well written. Next, The Phantom of the Opera by Gaston LaRue, one of the most ingenious books I read this year, full of trickery. And the story, the way it was told, it was really artfully constructed, actually, when one considers the lurid pulp aspects of the tale itself. Yeah, that was a good find. Then, A Little Princess by Frances Hodgson Burnett, not to my liking. Nowhere near as good as The Secret Garden, a kind of hymn to capitalism. Oh, it's kind of awful, actually. And finally, we have Thomas Hardy, Under the Greenwood Tree, the first of his Wessex novels, and really it was the village of Melchester that was the star here. This was excellent too, just let down by the central male character being so poorly developed, but nevertheless a fine read. There we have it. That was 1 to 30 of the books I read this year. I hope you enjoyed my little walk through them. I'll be back in a few days with part 2, but there's no real rush. I'm kind of taking things easy as the year draws to a close. So now all I have to do is say goodbye. Be safe, be strong, and I shall see you all very soon. But for now, Nanu Nanu.